I'm Catherine Tomlinson and I started an eco-conscious pottery company called Oxford Clay. So I don't just make pottery, I make resources for other potters wanting to be more eco-friendly in their pottery practice. And that's what this podcast is all about. It's about sharing everything I've learned along my eco-conscious pottery journey with you. And I'm so glad you're here with me. Let's go. Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Oxford Clay Pottery Podcast. I'm Catherine, and today we're going to be talking about a simple three-step process, three-step framework you can apply to find out the kind of ecological and social impact of any pottery material. Okay, so the reason I've recorded this episode is because when I first started trying to kind of understand the environmental social impact of my pottery practice, I found it so hard to find out about the materials I was using, and also how they impacted on the environment, or the places where they were mined. And so the more I researched, the more I realized that this could actually be kind of put into quite a simple framework. So what seems like a very kind of overwhelming process at the beginning, I don't know anything about these materials or where they come from, you can actually apply this framework and kind of understand a bit more about the likely impact, negative impact, or less negative impact of any pottery material that you might be using. So the first thing to say is that when we're talking about this, we really need to be using materials, or understanding materials as from a single origin. So there are some materials which this is very difficult framework to apply to, because they come from different parts of the world. And the way the supply chain works is that they're mixed and then they're sold internationally. So for example, if you take talc, the material talc is kind of notoriously kind of difficult to trace supply chains. So some is coming from one place, some is coming from another, some is legally mined, some is illegally mined, and legitimately mined sort of thing, or illegally mined. And it's all kind of mixed together and then it's sold. So if you're going to apply this framework, you need to know that the material that you're sort of trying to apply the framework to is from a single place, and you kind of need to know where that place is, basically. So how on earth do you find that out? Well, your pottery supplier should know where things come from. So for example, I use 3 different types of ball clay and a type of china clay, and all of them I know the exact mine they're from, and also the exact place where they're mined. So they're from southwest England, and quite often if you get, I'm not suggesting you buy a 25 kilogram bag of anything, but when you buy the full, they often come in 25 kilogram bags, these materials. So when you buy the full 25 kilogram bag, it will say exactly where, because it's from the original supplier. Basically, it will tell you, exactly the address where it was mined, and the company that's mining it, and so that material has come from that single source mine, mined by a certain company. So so I would advise asking your pottery supplier. Some will be able to tell you, some might not, depending on the material. Some have kind of technical experts working there who will be able to say, yeah, I know where this is from, and they'll be able to tell you. So ask them first, and then what we'll do is we'll talk about the framework then you can apply to know, once you know where your material's from, to understand its environmental impact. Okay, so you've got your material, and now you're thinking, well, how do I know the impact that it has on people and the environment of being mined, and so being mined and processed and transported. Okay, so the first thing to say is that there is a sort of carbon emissions aspect. So this is one of the 3 criteria, one of the 3 framework. is how far has that material had to come to get to you. Okay, so there's carbon emissions associated with the transport, with the haulage of that material. So for example, if you're using, a material, say like EPK China clay, coming from like a certain part of the world, or if you're based in the UK and you're using Groleg China clay, which is just from like Cornwall, it's safe to say that the haulage from the Groleg is going to be less than the EPK China clay, which is mined, transported internationally to get to you. So that's the first part of the framework. How far has that material had to come? Is there a material closer to you that you could use, basically? So that's the first part of the framework. Okay, the second part of the framework is that you want to look at what is the regulatory framework of the region in which that material is mined. So if an area has sort of good levels of regulation, if it's got robust regulation that's in its kind of civic structures, or if it's in its legal structures, and if it's got civic structures that are able to uphold the regulation, then chances are, the environment will be protected. People mining that material will be protected by health and safety legislation. The environment, it will be protected from the mining companies, and there might be legislation that means that mining companies have to do mitigation work. They have to make sure they're protecting the environment as they mine that material. So what is the level of regulation in that region? So if the level of regulation is weak, or if they don't have the civic structures in place to enforce regulation, then that's problematic. So if, for example, there's a lot of artisanal mining in that sector, which means that like people are informally mining, they're not protected by health and safety legislation, they're self-employed, they don't have to use, sort of health and safety equipment, there's perhaps child labour in that industry as well. Those indications, where there's a weak regulatory framework or where there's not the civic structures in place to uphold it, that indicates that potentially environmental and social harm could be caused by the production of that material, that pottery material. So, for example, cobalt, it has problematic. There's a whole episode I've done on cobalt, and yeah, cobalt has problematic supply chains in that respect. So whereas say like other materials, say like if they're mined in places that have more strict regulatory frameworks, say for example a country that's part of the EU, and the EU legislative body upholding those workers' rights, environmental protection, taxes from mining companies, the kind of practices they're allowed to use, those things will uphold the protecting the environment and protecting people. Okay, so regulatory framework is the second part of this kind of framework to assess the harm of pottery materials after haulage and transport. So the third thing that you need to look at in terms of the framework to assess the environmental impact of a pottery material is the energy mix of the region where the material was mined. So different regions, different countries have different ways of getting their energy. So some countries will use more renewable energy, and some countries will rely more on like fossil fuels to get the energy for their national grid, basically. So generally speaking, if a region is using a lot of fossil fuels, that will generate more kind of carbon emissions, perhaps air pollution, more than a country which is using much more like renewable sources of energy. So that is something you can look at in terms of like, what is this country? What is this energy mix? And so is it likely that this mine basically is using renewable energy or not? Just a kind of slight caveat to that, a slight complication, is that if a mine is very remote, then it can actually use sort of a lot of fossil fuels because it will be kind of like off grid. So it could be maybe using, diesel for haulage or for powering machinery. And conversely, some mines that are very remote also use, they create their own energy by renewable sources. There could be like solar power. So like some remote mines, like for example in Australia, they can be using they can be using renewable energy sources because they're so remote. They can't get, enough fuel basically to power their machinery on the mine. So that is that is a slight caveat to that. But if you want to sort of read more about this framework, I've actually detailed it in Eco-Conscious Pottery Glazing, that book, which you can get from the Oxford Clay website, or you can get it from Amazon as well. And it just goes through the framework and also, some really good sources of information if you want to look up the energy mix of a country. So I'll actually put how I found the energy mix of a country. I'll put that in the show notes because there's a report that's produced every year and you can just look it up basically. It's very easy to find that information. Okay, so let's have a quick recap. So you've got a pottery material, you're like, I don't know what its environmental, social impact is. Step one, find out where it comes from. Does it come from a single source, a single region, a single mine? If it does, then great, you'll be able to do the assessment basically. Step number two, okay, so you need to find that back from your pottery supplier. Step number two is that you want to kind of think about how far has this material had to come to get to me. So that will be a good indication of how much energy has been used for the material to, get to where you are. So it could be the fuel that was used, for example, could be like fossil fuels in terms of its haulage to get to you. Okay, so the next step number 3, is that you can look at the regulatory framework of that country, that region. So if it has a robust regulatory framework, then it's pretty safe to say that the environment will be protected as far as possible, and also people will be protected. I'm not saying it's perfect, but I'm saying that there's a very wide range of environmental and people protection. So generally regulation can mean that people and the environment are protected. Like I said, I'm not saying it's perfect, but it's a good indication that there are at least mechanisms in place to hold people to account, to hold mining companies to account, to hold people who damage the environment to account. So is there a regulatory framework in place, and are there the civic structures in place to be able to sort of uphold this legislation for people who maybe break the legislation? And then step 4 is that what is the energy mix of that region? What is the energy mix of that country? What's their national grid made up of? How do they get their energy? How is that mine running? Is it running mainly on fossil fuels, or is it mainly running from renewable sources from the energy grid? Like I said, I will link that in the show notes, the report, to find out the energy mix of a country. And if you want to read more information, like I was saying to you, there's more information in Eco-Conscious Pottery Glazing book, where we go through that framework in a bit more detail. And so I hope you've enjoyed this episode. I know it can feel overwhelming. Like, what is this pottery material? I don't understand where it is. Where has it come from? What is it? The information it's there for you, and just take it one step at a time. Ask the pottery supplier, and then just a bit of investigation, and you can kind of get an indication of its environmental harm and social harm. So until then, happy potting, and I will see you next time on the Oxford Clay podcast, and thank you so much for joining me. Bye. So if you enjoyed that and you're interested to learn more about eco-conscious pottery, head over to the Oxford Clay website, which is www.oxfordclay.co.uk. I can't wait to see you there.